Kim, what is on your radar?
All right, listen. Sanctions, like the ones we have on Russia and Iran and Cuba, they don't work. Not only do they not work, they often achieve the opposite effect. They harm our economy, and most importantly, they put our national security at risk. Now, I get it. Maybe you want to punish bad leaders of foreign countries without having to wage actual war, and cutting them off from the global economy seems like a better alternative. It's potentially far more damaging to the U.S., and we should stop. So in order to understand this, let me first tell you what sanctions are exactly. Sanctions can be against entire countries, government leaders and representatives, random individuals, wealthy business people, companies, or even industries. For example, I'm sure you're aware we've been sanctioning Cuba over Fidel Castro, North Korea since the Korean War, Iran since the fall of the Shah. Most recently, we've been sanctioning Russia because of the war in Ukraine. But we also sanction government leaders. For example, there are several Chinese officials who are sanctioned over Hong Kong and the Uyghurs. The U.S. government also chooses to sanction wealthy people, such as Russian oligarchs, companies accused of engaging in fraudulent or corrupt practices, and even specific industries can be sanctioned. As it stands right now, 1 in 10 countries are under some form of U.S. sanctions. Now, the sanctions can be in the form of banning trade, freezing assets, heavier taxation, or prohibiting financial dealings. This part's important to understand. The way we go about doing this is we actually ban American companies and American people from trading or financially dealing with anyone on the list of countries, companies, and individuals. The government can't control them, but the government can control us. So the government also uses secondary sanctions by threatening allies. For example, we tell Europeans to join in on our sanctions or face sanctions themselves. We sound like really charming friends. So if you operated a company that did a lot of business with these countries or individuals, and suddenly there are sanctions on them, your company will obviously suffer financially. So if you're a manufacturer of some goods, for example, and you typically ship a fair amount over to Russia, now that we have sanctions on Russia, it's your responsibility as the American to stop shipping to them, not their responsibility to stop receiving them. So if you offer financial services, it's your responsibility to make sure none of your clients are on one of these lists. So just on the surface, sanctions are a burden to American companies and people who are constantly having to figure out who is on or off these lists. On top of this, sanctioning hurts American businesses who are now banned from doing any business with them. So do you think any of this really hurts Russians when it comes to banning things like iPhones, Gucci bags, BMWs, and Chanel perfume? Do you think that hurts them when it's banned from entering their country? I'm sure many Russians were upset that they couldn't get these luxury items, but it's not like they needed these things. But do you know who does need these luxury items? The people who manufacture them, market them, and distribute them. All of the workers who are behind the operation of those companies are now at risk of losing their jobs because of lack of sales and business. If you were a shipping company and your primary client was Russia, you're probably out of business right now and all of your workers are laid off. Now, trade, of course, isn't only just luxury items. Lots of trade involves essentials like medicine, food, and energy. Sanctions that involves these types of items not only hurt those who are manufacturing and distributing them, but they significantly hurt the poor people inside of the targeted nation. Wealthy people in those countries will always have access to the things they need. It's the poor who suffer. But that's actually the point. One idea is to cause so much suffering amongst the population that the government eventually feels enough compassion to stop the pain. And in order to stop the pain, they have to stop whatever it is that caused them to be sanctioned in the first place. The other idea is to cause so much pain in the population that the population rises up and topples the government under the hope that if a new government were installed, the sanctions would stop. But they don't work. We've been implementing these sanctions on several nations for decades now, and what are the results? In many instances, when it's essential medicine or food that's involved, we end up being perceived by the world as heartless bullies. On top of this, did Cuba ever topple the Castro government? Is the Ayatollah of Iran no longer in power? Is Assad no longer the president of Syria? What about North Korea? What good has it done there? These sanctions have not worked as intended. In all of the cases I just mentioned, the people of those countries have not turned on their own leaders. They know the U.S. is causing the sanctions. They're not stupid. So rather than blaming their own governments, they instead blame, get this, the U.S. You could insist that it's not true, that instead their governments are brutal dictators that don't care about the suffering of their own people. But then I would have to ask, if that's the case, why are we punishing the people on top of them being punished by their own government? Isn't the point of sanctions to get their government to stop abusing them? So why add to it? But honestly, we could debate back and forth all day how these people feel or what their governments are like. The bottom line is their governments are intact, even after decades of U.S. imposed sanctions. They haven't worked. So why are we continuing to use a tool that doesn't work? But here's where sanctions become an issue of national security. The only reason the U.S. can use sanctions as a weapon and compel allies to go along with them or else is because the U.S. dollar is the world reserve currency. Most global trade is conducted in dollars, so it's harder to ignore sanctions or get around them. Everyone wants dollars because everyone can spend dollars, particularly on oil, which has pretty much been nearly exclusively exchanged in dollars after a deal was struck between the U.S. and Saudi Arabia. We agreed to give them security. They agreed to sell us oil. They agreed to sell oil in U.S. currency. And because of this, over the past 80 years, the dollar has remained extremely stable, valuable, and it gives the U.S. a lot of power. But sentiments towards the United States have shifted. Look at Saudi Arabia. They've been feeling pretty snubbed by the Biden administration, resulting in speculation over whether or not Biden would shake or fist bump the Saudi crown prince's hand while visiting the country. Why is Biden there? Well, quite frankly, he's there to beg for relief from high oil prices, caused in part, by the way, by our sanctions on Venezuela, Iran, and Russia, and to repair relations now that Saudi Arabia is in accelerated talks with China to begin accepting yuan as payment for oil. The United States being so trigger happy to use our economic power against those we disagree with has caused many countries to begin moving away from the dollar out of fear they could be next on the naughty list. No one wants to get hit with sanctions, and no one knows what's going to cause them to be hit with sanctions next. Now, countries won't be able to move away from the dollar overnight. Old habits die hard, but they're trying. The sanctions on Russia since its invasion of Ukraine have actually accelerated de-dollarization. Countries trying to circumvent U.S. imposed sanctions with Russia are now trading in their own national currencies for the oil and wheat Russia provides. But de-dollarization efforts have been going on long before this war with Russia. China has struck deals with Australia, Japan, Brazil, Iran, and others to trade in national currencies. Russia, China, and other countries have been rapidly setting up alternative monetary systems since 2014, knowing that at any minute they could be hit with more U.S. sanctions. The world is looking for an alternative. The U.S. dollar won't be ditched as a major global currency, but soon it won't be the only one. Once it's no longer needed to conduct global trade, it will drastically lose its value. Right now, we rely on countries, China being one of the biggest, to support our deficit spending with massive loans. They'll only continue doing this if the dollar remains valuable because it's needed to conduct global trade. We also need the dollar to remain strong so that the things we buy from other countries, which is just about everything, will remain affordable. Essentially, if the dollar is no longer in highest demand, we, the American people, feel the effects the strongest. We're talking extremely high inflation. And quite frankly, some of the inflation we're feeling right now could be because this process has already begun. So we need to stop using the power of being the world's reserve currency as a weapon and start earning the goodwill in the community of nations. The goodwill we've been squandering since World War II. We need to earn respect in the world by insisting our government reflect the will of the good and fair American people. And we also need to insist that our politicians stop firing off their weapons of all kinds, be they monetary or physical, and start thinking about what ramifications their decisions have on not only the innocent people in these foreign countries, but on us, the American people. So I'm curious, Batya and Robbie, what do you guys think about U.S. sanctions? I mean, in my mind, obviously, they're not working and they're harmful and damaging. Should we continue doing them?
No.
I go first.
Yeah, no, I totally agree with you, Kim. I've said this many times, and the Cuban example is the best, right? If more than 50 years, more than half a century of trying to persuade of putting, even worse than sanctions, a full embargo on the regime in order to inspire the people to rise up and overthrow the regime. If it didn't work for more than half a century, why would it work ever anywhere else?
Right.
It just makes it doesn't work. It's like you said, it inspires resentment of the U.S., not of the dictators, but just of the U.S., and it doesn't work. Does not seem to work.
What's your take on him?
I think I'm with both of you. I wouldn't say that I have a kind of like blanket approach to this. I think each case should be approached individually. But to me, I just have no appetite for us being the moral police of the world when here at home we don't have enough like like morality to look at our fellow Americans and make decisions that would be best for them. So to me, like I liked your approach, Kim, because in each case it seemed that you were saying, look, these are immoral because of what they do to the poor in these countries, but also because of what they do in terms of the interests here at home. They're not in our interests. I think that the sanctions on Russia are the perfect example of that. You know, I'm sorry, but I am still not convinced that, that funding that war forever is more moral than making sure that my fellow American can drive their children to school. I just have not yet been convinced by that. And so I think the question, especially in this moment when gas is up 60% and is, the primary cause behind inflation being at 9.1% historically, right? A lot of these questions are coming up. And I think that, there wasn't a lot that you said that I disagreed with. It was just that, I think each case really should be approached individually. And the number one question should be, I mean, like President Trump said, like, is this in our interests? Like, our number one concern should be our fellow Americans.
And I want to say, I do think it's maybe a little bit too late, unfortunately. I think that we've been using these sanctions as a weapon for so long that now, these countries have been building up alternatives and seeking other types of currency to trade in. And they've been doing this for the last 8 years to a decade. I mean, they've all kind of caught on to the sanctions thing. And now that process is rapidly happening. And so I think what we have to do is kind of focus on stopping the bleeding on that. But definitely, right now, we Americans have been riding high on the hog for a while, and our politicians as well. And this will come back to bite us soon. And when we start feeling even higher inflation because of this, because of the dropping or the just backing off, I mean, I don't think the U.S. is going to be replaced as the global reserve currency. I just don't think it'll be the only one. I think the hegemony will be broken up, and that will mean more selection, and that'll just mean increased inflation for us Americans. And I think that's coming really soon. We're seeing it maybe now. And when it really takes full effect, as China rises and as they strengthen their relationships with other countries around the world, I think many Americans are going to look back and point directly at sanctions and say this was the major downfall of U.S. foreign policy. It came down to sanctions. So mark my words, 10 years from now, there'll be many discussions all around the news saying we shouldn't have done that. We shouldn't have done that.
Well, shouldn't have done it. We're having that discussion today and again probably a decade from now. Oh no. All right. Thank you very much, Kim. We'll have more Rising right after this.